Hello and welcome to all of our attendees and speakers today. Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you may be joining us from for this webinar. Thank you for joining TransCellerate's webinar, Developing a Novel Measurement of Sleep and Rheumatoid Arthritis, Study Proposal for Approach and Considerations. My name is Tyler Reynolds and I am a Program Manager here at TransCellerate overseeing our patient-focused program of initiatives. Today I have the distinct pleasure of moderating and introducing an exciting session on Novel Digital Endpoints, the highly accomplished set of speakers and panelists. Today is the second part in a three-part webinar series hosted by TransCellerate, the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, and the Digital Medicine Society. All three organizations have teamed up to discuss and share the various resources and insights available for using novel digital endpoints in clinical trials. The series began, for those who were not able to attend, on August 2nd with a great presentation by Jen Goldsack and the Digital Medicine Society, and a recording of that is available on DIME's website. Today, you'll hear from TransCellerate in the named session I had just mentioned, before we conclude our three-part series on October 5th with the session hosted by Citi and Lindsay Kehoe on next steps for obtaining novel endpoint reliability and acceptance. The registration for that final session is currently open and certainly encourage all of our attendees here today to go ahead and register for that as well. In addition to this three-part series, our three organizations will be teaming up once more for a short course at DIA on October 21st as part of the Digital Technology in Clinical Trials Conference. Registration for that is also open, and so if you wish to hear more of these three webinar topics in conjunction together, again, absolutely encourage and welcome any of our audience members to sign up and participate in that session. As we jump into today, I did want to spend just a moment introducing the audience to TransCellerate. So for those who are unfamiliar, TransCellerate is a not-for-profit entity founded in 2012 under the principle of collaboration. Today, its membership is comprised of 20 global pharmaceutical companies, all working together to improve the health of people around the world by accelerating and simplifying the R&D of innovative new therapies. Over 1,000 member company experts have contributed to more than 70 publicly available solutions on TransCellerate's website. And today's discussion is on one of our most recent publications that you'll hear from our speakers about in just a bit. TransCellerate organizes its 20+ active initiatives across three strategic areas and really focuses on producing and maintaining a pragmatic portfolio of work. These are primarily organized into three strategic priorities: harmonizing process and sharing information, improving the patient and site experience, as well as enhancing sponsor efficiencies and drug safety. These 20 initiatives actively contribute to the mission of the organization I had mentioned just previously. And here today with us are representatives from our Patient Technology Initiative, which is who undertook the topic of novel digital endpoints in some of their most recent work. More importantly, I'm joined by three exciting team members and key leaders from that patient technology workstream. They've all been involved in the development of the solutions of this work and are subject matter experts in their own right. It's my privilege to introduce you to Michelle Kruhamel, Head Digital Science at AbbVie, Lotta Lyons, Global Regulatory Director, Clinical Trial Innovation and Digital Health at Roche, and Joe Mather, Executive Director, Early Clinical Development at Pfizer. Over the next 60 minutes, you'll hear from Michelle, Lotta, and Joe as they introduce our Patient Technology Initiative and, most importantly, the team's work on novel digital endpoints. At the conclusion of the presentation, they will be joined by two other experts, Jen Goldsack from the Digital Medicine Society and Lindsay Kehoe from Citi, for a 30-minute panel and audience Q&A session. Before we jump into the presentation and the panel discussion on the back of today, just a couple of ground rules for the audience and the presenters to be aware of. Participation in questions is fully voluntary, as is the use of any TransCellerate assets or tools, and you don't have to identify in your questions who you work for. Things that we will not be able to discuss and ask you to stay away from include specific vendors or CROs being used by any of the presenters or audience members, any specific issues you have with those organizations, long-term development plans, and anything related to costs. And as I'd mentioned, generally the topics of vendors, costs, and use of solutions will not be able to be answered in our Q&A. To quickly orient the group to the platform that we are on today, we are using GoToWebinar. So a couple of things to be aware of here. All participants are automatically muted to enter the call, and you can dial into audio via either your phone or computer, whichever your preference. And should you have a difficulty seeing the slides for any reason, if you click the orange rectangular box with the white arrow in the top right of your control panel, that will minimize that and allow you a more full view of the screen and the materials being shared. If you do have questions for the presenters, and we certainly encourage any questions you may have, you can use the questions drop down in that control panel. Your question will be viewable by our panelists as well as our presenters, and we will use that to inform the panel discussion in the last 25 and 30 minutes of today's conversation. Relatedly, we will be using the live polling feature. This will help us to better understand, I think, a bit of our audience and their current level of knowledge and interaction with novel digital endpoints. And so the polling functionality is fully voluntary, so your participation is not required, though encouraged, and all responses will be anonymous. So responses are presented as a full percentage of respondents, and so we will not know in particular what your individual response is. And as I mentioned, these questions will help us out as we move through the presentation today, but again, into the discussion and some of the areas we might want to spend some more time on. When the polls do go live, you'll be presented with the options and a radio button next to each option. It's easy enough to respond. Simply click the radio button next to the answer choice you'd intend to select. We will collate those responses automatically in the background, and then after 5 to 10 seconds, we will share those results with the audience. So with that, I do want to jump into a couple of questions here before I hand it off to Michelle as our first presenter. And I think the first question we'd like to better understand is, have you had a chance to review the article that we will be speaking about today? Give it about 5 more seconds here, and then we can share the results of that. All right. So it looks like we have a mixed audience, which is great. So some of you have had a chance to read the paper, which is fantastic. Many of you have not, which is also perfectly okay, as we'll be covering in great detail today. And then those who've had a chance to partially review it, again, we will hopefully be able to fill in any gaps you may have from that. The next question we'd love to know a little bit more about from you before we dive in is whether you are involved in novel digital endpoints at your current organization. We'll give that about 5 more seconds. All right. Similarly, it looks like about 2/3 are involved, with 1/3 not involved. I think this is a great split, and some of the content we'll go through again should hopefully be applicable to both audiences here today. And then one final question, and then I will hand it off to Michelle to walk us through some of the specific content itself, is whether your company is involved in novel digital endpoints. So one beyond your role, but your company. All right, I think we can go ahead and close that one. And that looks like a resounding, I think, majority towards yes. So thank you very much for that. And then I did misspeak. There is just one final question, so bear with us here for another 30 seconds. And this is to better understand how much experience you have with novel digital endpoints. None, minimal, moderate, or significant. All right, and I think we can wrap this one up. Very good. Well, I think between today from our session, as well as when we're joined by Lindsay and Jen, we will certainly be able to, I think, share some fantastic resources available to you for those with none or minimal or even moderate experience with novel digital endpoints. And as I had mentioned, please do not hesitate to ask any questions via the chat. We have a dedicated portion of time at the end here to get to hopefully as many of those as we can, and we will do our best to address them. So with that, Michelle, I will hand it off to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Tyler, and thank you everyone for joining the call. As Tyler mentioned, I'm the head of digital science at AbbVie. I lead a team of digital strategists and data scientists to develop novel digital endpoint to support drug development program and help with product differentiation. And so I also have the great honor and privilege of being co-leading the Novel Digital Endpoint team, which is a sub-team within the Translate Patient Technology Initiative. The goal of the Patient Technology Initiative, for some of you who don't know, is to enable and accelerate the adoption of patient-facing technology in the clinical trials. As an industry consortia, many of us actually passionately believe that patient-facing technology presents opportunity that can transform drug development and the patient experience. Particularly, I think the digital health tools, particularly the wearables and sensors, may allow us to detect treatment benefit in a much more objective and sensitive manner, all potentially from the comfort of the patient's own home. And in addition, we're also seeing the industry trend has great interest in deploying decentralized clinical trials. And we believe that having high quality and validated novel digital endpoint is a fundamental component to have a successful DCT. And therefore, this has been a core effort of our patient technology team. However, as you all know, to develop and validate a novel digital endpoint is not a small feat. It really requires a multidisciplinary effort and multi-studies and also strategic planning with regulatory alignment in order to achieve that success. Therefore, for us to serve the industry need, the patient technology team has developed many tools over the years, including they published a research paper specific describing the current landscape of patient technology and what are the benefits, the gaps, and opportunities are. The second tools is a very comprehensive patient technology toolkit that has been published on the Translate website. I will highly recommend everyone on this call to download and leverage that toolkit. The third tool that has been published is a shared insight knowledge base and associated white paper. So Translate has bring together over 81 use cases that published and shared by our member companies around how they deploy patient technology into their clinical trials. There's a lot of learning being gleaned from these aggregated results in the white paper. So again, I highly recommend you download these materials from our Translate website and leverage the information. And today, we're going to talk about is the latest tool that Novel Digital Endpoint team had developed. This is a research paper and specifically describe a step-by-step approach and consideration how you can actually develop a novel digital endpoint such as sleep in the rheumatoid arthritis in the context of drug development and with the regulatory pathways and strategy planning consideration. So next slide, please. So we talk about novel digital endpoint. By definition, I just want to kind of ground everybody. There are two types of novel digital endpoint. First one is with existing endpoint, but measure in a new way. And the second type is actually a novel concept, a novel endpoint connecting with the disease activity, but also measure in a new way. So it's really important for any of you that wanted to develop novel digital endpoint to understand like which type of novel NDE that you are actually approaching, because it's very common for people to assume, okay, type 2 definitely require more work than type 1. However, it's also important to notice that the type 1 is not necessarily just a simple low-hanging fruit and easy to work with. There's a significant challenge in this space is to justify how, what, and why the new tools is actually better than the traditional. And then how would you validate and prove the value of this new measurement? Next slide, please. So we know there are two types of NDE, and how do you develop it? And so we have defined a very kind of 5-step process for us to actually consider how you start this process. And the framework of NDE development is actually not new to the drug development field. It is actually built on two very well-defined and well-established guidance published by FDA. The first one is actually patient-centered outcome research. And the second one is actually clinical outcome assessment research. So as you all know, every drug has side effect. And in order for a drug to get approval, not only it has to meet all the safety requirements, but from efficacy perspective, it has to prove that it can actually help patients to feel better or function more and live longer. So it is really important when you're developing a drug to actually identify what outcome truly matter to patients so they can actually be able to demonstrate improvement of that specific outcome or improvement of that symptom. So that's really the step one. And it's no different when we're actually considering using digital endpoint to generate the evidence and support drug development. And so once you have identified what outcome truly matter to patient, the next is to actually justify and clarify that, well, is existing tool not able to do the job, and would the digital health tool actually add value? And if you can actually clearly justify why that's the case, then the next step is to identify the fit for purpose tool that can help you measure that concept of interest that you wanted to measure. And there's many different type of so-called fit for purpose, right? So it depends on what context you wanted to actually measure, that fit could actually vary. So my colleague Joe will go into more detail around how to select a fit for purpose tool, particularly for the sleep measurement in the RA context, but I won't elaborate further here. But the next step is once you identify the sensor, we also need to consider the patient experience. Would this actually worsen the patient experience as a whole, or particularly around the compliance issue, if the tool may require a lot of charging, and also some of the form factor might affect them how much they want to wear it in their daily activities. So those are the key considerations when we're actually developing the novel digital endpoint, because your end user need to be able to wear it. And finally, a lot of the novel digital endpoint really all supposed to start with an exploratory endpoint and to prove that it actually tests your hypothesis, improving your hypothesis before you can move into pivotal trials. So how would the data be used in the beginning stage could be very, very different when you're actually moving into a pivotal trial. So there are two very different scenarios you will have to take into consideration, and that will also dictate how the backend vendor system requirement, and when you're selecting the vendor, how those requirements will change. That depends on your data use. So with that said, next is our polling question. So we're wondering what part of the V3 framework have you encountered the most challenge? Hope everybody on the call familiar with the V3 framework. Can we close it? See the result? Very interesting. I hope our paper and our subsequent discussion will actually help you understand a bit more about different level of validation when you're considering developing a novel digital endpoint. So next slide, please. So far we've seen the industry have tried and conduct many pilots to develop a novel digital endpoint. However, there are still numerous challenges that need to be overcome. For example, the industry seems to have very limited understanding of the evidentiary requirement in achieving the label claim approach. And then we're also seeing that the regulatory pathway to achieve and get novel digital endpoint qualified can be very lengthy, and many companies are trying to figure out how can we actually accelerate that process. And then even despite a lot of the effort that we put in, there's still a high degree of a regulatory uncertainty whether at the end are you going to be able to get the regulatory acceptance of that endpoint. And we're also seeing very broad, there's a limited understanding on the development and validation and implementation best practice. So with all these challenges in mind, we have designed a very differentiated approach, differentiated in a sense that it's differentiated from the city effort and also Diamond effort and many other consortia effort. We have developed a near real study basically in the context of a drug development with the FDA and EMA regulatory pathway in mind, and present this paper as almost like a paper-based how-to guide, and then hopefully the industry can actually learn from this paper-based demonstration study and adopt the process forward. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is a paper that actually basically describes from the ideation all the way to regulatory strategy and pathway, how you navigate, how you develop from scientific justification, and actually come to the clinical meaningfulness selection of the concept of interest you want to measure, and also justify the value of using digital health tool, and then select the fit for purpose tool and design the sample size, and so on and so forth. So it's really a detailed step-by-step how-to guide and putting into a specific drug development context, so you can actually see how the example can actually help you guide you think through in your own case in the future. So without further ado, we'd like to start getting into the paper. And next slide, please. So I'll set a context about the rheumatoid arthritis as the context of the paper. So the reason we chose rheumatoid arthritis, it is a very common and complex disease, and many pharmaceutical companies are working in this space. As many of you know, patients with RA often will report they have severe joint swelling and pain and stiffness. And interestingly, the second most common reported symptom is actually sleep disturbance and daytime fatigue. And we also noticed that some moderate to high disease activity patients often would report they have very poor sleep, and it would suggest that sleep disturbance may be correlating with the disease activity. However, it is really unclear whether the sleep disturbance is actually a direct result of RA or is a secondary manifestation. And so, from drug development and pathophysiology perspective, studying the RA, we also know that the regulation of sleep often is linked with the inflammatory cytokine and the production of the IL-6 and TNF-alpha. And so a lot of research have reported that in RA, the IL-6 and TNF are highly upregulated. And it's also associated with symptoms like daytime fatigue and sleep disturbance. So with this kind of background, you can actually start developing a scientific hypothesis, considering, well, will an agent that can actually reduce IL-6 and TNF-alpha could potentially not only improve this joint swelling symptoms, but also improve sleep. So with that background, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Joe. He will take you through like how we designed the study to then further test the hypothesis using the novel digital endpoint development approach. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the handoff, and welcome everybody to the webinar this morning. I mean, fundamentally, we approach this from the aspect of what is important to the patient when we are designing the concept as well as the scientific hypothesis that we're intending to answer. And so from this standpoint, Michelle's already laid out the concept of what we're trying to measure and what patient population. We're looking at moderate to severe RA patients. And in that population, we're fundamentally looking at the impact of the rheumatoid arthritis severity and symptoms on patients' sleep quality, sleep quantity, as opposed to quality or stage of sleep. And for that aspect, we can use digital technologies such as wearable accelerometers like the Actigraph device or other three-dimensional accelerometers that are wearable on the wrist location to essentially quantify the amount of sleep, such as sleep opportunity, wake to sleep onset, other amounts of wake bouts or time asleep versus sleep efficiency. Those transformations of the accelerometry signals are essentially processed through algorithms and analytical pipelines and cleaned into endpoints that are similar to that of polysomnography and in-clinic assessments of sleep amounts and sleep stage. And then fundamentally, what we want to understand is how those endpoints map on from a patient perspective onto reduction in joint pain, which is primarily a primary endpoint for most RA and anti-inflammatory approaches, the reduction in fatigue or tiredness, reduction in stiffness of joints. And the new concept that we're adding overall in a development label path would be increased amount of sleep as a consequence of anti-inflammatory or anti-cytokine treatments like an anti-TNF antibody. And so fundamentally on the next slide, we approach this from a clinical validation package from the gold standards or reference standards such as polysomnography and ECG. And in those studies, effectively patients are brought into an in-clinic sleep lab. They're monitored both video and ECG and EMG signals. They're processed for the sleep stage, the sleep amount, and the amount of stages they go through in a night. But we're then adding on the mobile sensing technologies or biometric sensing technologies that the Actigraph or accelerometers have. And in that situation, we're effectively understanding how their movement corresponds to the amount of sleep they're having during that total sleep opportunity. And so from the next standpoint, we're actually trying to understand is, do the algorithms validate against the endpoints we're measuring in the clinic? And fundamentally, how do they map onto real-world evidence or real-world collection of that data? And so what we're trying to understand is how the patients are able to utilize the device, where this fits into their lifestyle as well as other aspects. That's going to have an influence on the amount of data we collected and the quality of data we're collecting. And we are determining in this case study, essentially, what is the use case for this technology? How well does it meet the objectives from our scientific hypothesis and data quality perspective? Ultimately, we're trying to also assess the technical feasibility from an end-to-end solution, both from a privacy and security perspective. And then ultimately, we're going to compare ground truth in the sleep lab to the at-home data to understand how those two aspects relate to each other so we can make a determination for sample size estimates in the population we're intending to measure for analytical validation and fit for purpose in further interventional studies that are beyond the scope of this discussion. Next slide. So when we're talking about data quality and reliability of variables for the sensor data, there's a lot of different things that can influence the quality of the data we're actually collecting. And one of the fundamental things we're trying to do is essentially understand the receptor operating curves for the endpoints as compared to ground truth or reference data like polysomnography. And we're also trying to understand the amount of data we need to collect on an individual to make a determination that the endpoint or change is measurable in the patient population. And so there's a number of different things we need need to test with construct validity and what variables we're going to actually determine as our interventional study endpoints. But what we're trying to determine in the methodology or case study we're talking about today is essentially comparisons from what's in the population in the clinical assessment versus the actigraphy data or accelerometry data, and trying to understand where there are gaps or incongruities in the endpoints versus the real world solution. And fundamentally, when we get down to the bottom of this kind of has a comparison between populations. So PSG is validated for the general population as well as RA, but there is a limited amount of data there in patient populations. And then the actigraphy data has been essentially tested from a construct of activity monitoring in normal healthy volunteers. And what we're trying to do now is assess the two pieces in the patient population at home and in the clinic for retest reliability. And then at the end of the day, we have a comparison on the accuracy, the specificity, and how well this algorithm and endpoints are actually able to measure the derived endpoints that are equivalent to polysomnography in the clinical setting. And so that takes a particular amount of processing, and really is where the analytical validation comes from in the V3 framework. Next slide. So what we're trying to do at the end of the day in this study is come up with a criteria for demonstrating that the assessments we're making are claiming that has been claimed by either the device manufacturer or are developed by the sponsor from an analytical perspective, that we're able to actually measure the endpoints as determined by the clinical study team. We're then effectively assessing whether or not the impairment, the measures are able to see a meaningful difference or a significant difference in change of sleep or amount of sleep during a given subjective period of time overnight or during a subjective day. And then we demonstrate and document how that change is related to the specific population as compared to either clinical outcome assessments or patient-reported outcome assessments. Or if you're doing qualitative research around the patient perspective, you're trying to identify the meaningfulness of the measure from their observable difference. And so essentially you're validating it not against the clinical standard like PSG, but you're trying to potentially also add input whether or not the patient can sense or understand the amount of change that they've had in their sleep pattern. And ultimately, we're effectively documenting this for future regulatory actions and also for sample size estimates in future studies, so we know how much to measure, what to measure, and what patient population we want to measure it in. Next slide. So for the purposes of the rest of the stuff, I'm going to introduce my colleague Lotta Lyons from Roche, and she's going to talk about the regulatory path for validation and qualification of the endpoints with the appropriate regulatory agencies. Thank you, Lotta.
Thank you, Joe. So now that you have heard from Joe and Michelle what the concept of interest was for this measure, and also what the validations plan were, you may be wondering, okay, what's the regulatory pathway that I actually go through to discuss this with the agencies? And that's what I'm gonna be discussing in my presentation. But first, let's go through two poll questions as well here. So the next slide, please. So let me read it. Which pathways are you actually using when you're getting in contact with regulatory agencies for your digital endpoint development? Are you using the drug development pathways to get acceptance from health authorities, or are you using the qualification pathways to get qualification from health authorities? Let's see the results of the poll. Okay, the drug development pathways. Very good. And one more question for you. Are they actually getting approved, accepted, or qualified? What is your experience with this and the pathways that you have been through? From what I see, mostly the drug development pathways. If we can see the results. Okay, interesting. Let's hope that the paper that we have presented today and that you will hopefully have time to read will help to change this into a yes. And also let's continue this multi-stakeholder collaborations to ensure we understand why this result is like this and that we can move the field forward. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we already had a look at the two different pathways and what you're using, but let me go through all of the different pathways that health authorities offer in order to discuss novel digital endpoints. And here, one key message is really that early dialogue is always very helpful with agencies to, from the beginning, understand their position on the validation studies that we need to do for endpoints, and also on what data would be acceptable for that acceptance of the endpoint in a pivotal trial, and or for the qualification of the endpoint. So if we look at the bottom of the image with the US pathways, we have at the early, more conceptual stages, we have the critical path innovation meeting, where sponsors can get in touch, or digital endpoint developments can get in touch with FDA to discuss at that conceptual stage. So here you will get non-binding feedback, and it's not really envisaged to discuss data, but it's a very good early dialogue platform to get in contact with the FDA. Once the sponsor has enough data to, or the validation studies planned out to go and have a more in-depth discussion with the agency, you have two possible pathways to go through. One is either through the drug development pathway, leveraging the IND, and requesting for a specific type C meeting for clinical outcome assessments. In that meeting, you can also request to have specific experts from the agency, for example, from COA experts or from CDRH, to discuss more in detail the digital health technology. And you would get then feedback within that drug development program. The other pathway is the drug development tool qualification program, where you would follow a 3-step procedure, and that would get through an official and transparent qualification in a specific context of use. Both pathways can be done in parallel, so sponsors can start the DDT pathway and in parallel have specific discussions through the Type C meetings in their IND for their program. If we look at the top of the image, we have the European pathway, so at the European Medicines Agencies. We also have the possibility of an early dialogue in form of an innovation task force meeting, where again it would be more at that conceptual stage to see what the interest is in this novel measure and how, so getting some initial feedback on the plans for development and the concepts that we're looking into. Once we have again more detailed validation studies to discuss with the agency and also more data, sponsors could go through the qualification advice and opinion procedure to get at the end to that official opinion in one context of use, or as well leverage the scientific advice procedure to have a discussion within one specific drug development program. If we go to the next slide, please. One important thing to consider is that what is qualified is the actual measure, so clinical outcome assessment or biomarker, to be used as an endpoint in a trial. The digital health technology tool is not what is qualified, but that said, it's really important that the agencies also evaluate the analytical validation, as we have seen before, data, and as well that we have the requirements of the digital health technology tool reflected in that opinion or DDT program, or as well in the drug development type pathways. Now, what would be the regulatory strategy for the use case that we have, for the case study that we have presented to you today? As we are looking into a case study of a sponsor developing a novel digital endpoint, a measure of sleep in rheumatoid arthritis, in parallel to a drug development program, we are proposing for this case study to use in the US and the IND pathway, so to have Type C COA meetings before the start of phase 2, so that we can demonstrate that the digital health technology is fit for purpose, so that we can discuss the development plan and also determine that the endpoint and measure we're looking into is acceptable for the FDA in that context of use. At the end of phase 2, we will be asking for another meeting to actually look at the data from the endpoint validation studies and present content validity and contract validity results and get acceptance for that use in that phase 3 pivotal trial. If we think about the EMA, the strategy that we will be proposing is to request a scientific qualification advice to go over the initial discussions about the digital health technology, the development plan and determination of the endpoint, and then going through a scientific advice after phase 2 to get acceptance for use in that final pivotal phase 3 study in rheumatoid arthritis. Of course, Other sponsors in other novel digital endpoint developments may ask for more meetings and may also ask them at different stages to what we're proposing here. But one clear recommendation is that if you're planning to use the novel digital endpoint in your phase 3 study and you're developing it together with the drug, it's very recommendable to have that interaction for the clinical outcome assessment before the start of the phase 3 to ensure that it's acceptable to use it as a primary or secondary endpoint, depending on what you're planning. Now, if we look at the actual tool that we're using, in our case, we are using a medical device, which is 510(k) cleared or CE marked. It could be as well that other sponsors are planning to use digital health technologies that are not medical devices, and that's okay. We'll need to have we'll need to still go through the analytical and technical validation to prove that the tool is appropriate, and also to take into account GXP compliance, like good clinical practice factors and others. So after those interactions with the agencies, we hope that the data that we'll be presenting from the validation studies will be acceptable, and we'll then be getting acceptance to use our novel digital endpoint of sleep in our phase 3 pivotal study of rheumatoid arthritis. If you're thinking about what timelines are you using, are you going to FDA first or to EMA first? As this would be the case study that we're talking about is a global development, we would be proposing to go in parallel to both agencies. So with that, next slide. Now I would like to summarize what Michelle, Joe, and myself have presented. So what are the requirements for a novel digital endpoint development? What are the key considerations that we need to take into account? We need to have clear scientific justification of what needs to be measured, and also that what we're measuring is a meaningful aspect of health of the patient's disease, and have a clear proof of that content validity that is actually relevant for patients. We need to have balance between fit for purposeness of the tool, usability of the tool, and also the data quality coming out of the tool, which are three very important factors to ensure that the success of the endpoint being used in the pivotal trial. As I said at the beginning, early engagement and alignment with regulatory agencies is essential to success, so that we know exactly where we stand on the plans that we have for validation. And I hope that by doing that, we can revert the poll results that we had from a majority of no to a majority of yes. Also, we can utilize the validation framework that we have presented, and that is also that we can find in the literature to assess the accuracy and reliability of the new endpoint. And we have to have that data ready before the pivotal trial to check with authorities. And of course, we need to show as well that we're using a fit for purpose measure that demonstrates clinical utility, as for example, with the MCID. And last but not least, we really need to strive for harmonization and alignment with key stakeholders to avoid that we're doing multiple measurement solutions for similar concepts of interest. And I know this is a topic that is dear to Jen's heart, and maybe she will touch on it in the discussion. And also on the aspect of health authority interactions, harmonization, and evidence requirements, we really call for multi-stakeholder collaboration to ensure we have clear evidence requirements and needs in the development of digital endpoints, fit for purpose regulatory pathways, and a clear path forward for digital endpoint developers and sponsors. Next slide. So Michelle pointed out to the tools that we have and the resources at the beginning of the talk, and here I would like to point you to them again. Please visit our Transcelerate site for more information on the tools. As well, you can follow the link that Colleen has put in the chat to learn about what are the different solutions that Michelle presented at the beginning. If you're using the solutions, please share with us your experience, as this really helps us understand how they're being used and also helps other sponsors see how they could be using them. And follow us on our social media channels, where you can learn about the new developments in Transcelerate and in this field. With that, over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Alada, and thank you, Joe. Thank you, Tyler, for the presentation. And I just want to take a moment and to really thank the team. This, has been really a long journey for the team to, develop the work. And as Alada mentioned, there are many tools that patient technology team had developed. And the Novel Digital Endpoint contributed with bringing the industry roundtable a couple of years ago, and then we actually really try to understand all different consortia are driving and to enable this industry to be able to actually advance in this area using these novel endpoint patient-facing tools to enable a better clinical trial and better experience for patients. And so, this is a lot of the industry passionate individuals come together and contributed effort. I just want to really take a moment to thank everyone. The team has been having a lot of diverse input. Many of them are actually the digital project leaders in all the pharma company, and the paper itself was coming from 14 different companies, a contribution. And although it's only 14 authors being mentioned, there's many, actually I'd like to be able to mention Matt Moyer and Burr Hartog and Kelly Erb. These are actually early members before predate me joining Transcelerate. They have laid out the vision, but the team had actually gone through the past few years of journey to actually bring their vision to reality. So I just want to take a moment to thank everyone. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank our partner. So many of you know Jen Goldsack, and she was actually quite a few years ago leading the Novel Digital Endpoint effort at Citi, and now she's actually the CEO of the Digital Medicine Society, and she's very passionate about this area. As you all know, she has developed leading the team, developed the playbook, launched a playbook, and also wrote many manuscripts, actually creating a lot of foundational work for industry to be able to adopt. Most known is the V3 framework that we have referenced over and over in our talk. And so this V3 framework now has been kind of broadly adopted in the industry, and we're seeing also Jen taking on tour duty to try to drive more and more adoption of this effort. So I just want to say a big thank you to you, Jen, for driving all the effort. And as Tyler mentioned, August 2nd, the first webinar that you launched has got a lot of download, a lot of interest, and we're looking forward to our next webinar that, move to the next slide, please. That is going to be driven and led by Citi. So Lindsay Kehoe is the project manager at Citi, and she has been leading this effort, building on the work that Jen and others has built on, define a lot of the work and continue to understand the industry's challenge and engage with regulator to drive some clarity in order for the industry to be able to advance in this area. So a big thank you to you, Lindsay, for all the hard work. And we're very much looking forward to the next webinar for your team to host. So I don't know if you want to actually take the minutes since we're ahead of schedule to talk about your slides.
Absolutely, that would be great. Well, thanks, Michelle, and thanks to the Transcelerate team really for an excellent presentation today. As Michelle mentioned, Citi is thrilled to continue the discussion about endpoint development and use at noon Eastern Standard Time on October 5th. This will be the third and final webinar of this series. And Alicia Staley from Metadata, and I will update you really on Citi's current initiative in this space and where we plan to head. So we'll take time to talk a little bit about our current work, and we'll also open it up for discussion with Jen and Michelle at the end to hear their thoughts on both short and long-term needs in this space. Next slide. So during this final webinar, we will be discussing, as I mentioned, Citi's current work, and that is a project called the Novel Endpoint Acceptance Project. It's really a continuation of Citi's existing novel endpoint work. And the purpose of this particular project is to advance on the use and acceptance of these digitally derived endpoints as key endpoints in clinical trials. This particular project is focused on clinical outcome assessments. Next slide. During our webinar on October 5th, we look forward to sharing some of the output of this work. This will include key findings from our in-depth interviews with sponsors, expert meeting highlights, a brief recap of our CPIN meeting that we held with the FDA, a quick snapshot into what we hope to develop over the next few months. So we have some great stuff to share with you, and we ask that you please register on Citi's webinar page, which is listed here, and really just hope to see you all there. Thanks again.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to all of our speakers here today, Michelle, Joe, and Lada, for walking us through some of the work the great work you had done within the Patient Technology Initiative here at Transcelerate. I think at this point in time, we do want to move into a bit of panel discussion and Q&A from the audience. We have received a handful of questions from the group, but certainly encourage anyone else who may have questions you'd like to be asked to utilize that question drop down in the dashboard on the right side of your screen here. And if questions come through that we run out of time for, or you have questions after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out. As I had mentioned, the session today is recorded, so you will have an opportunity to rewatch should you want to hear anything again or share with some of your colleagues at a later date. So with that, I will welcome Joe, Michelle, Lada, Lindsay, and Jen back to the discussion here. And maybe I'll start with, I think, a